Hello and welcome to the Cuyamonga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, and on behalf of our Board of Directors, advisors, volunteers, and supporting members, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamonga Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman. And as an educational institution, we take an open approach. And we invite scholars of parallel research to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration, and that's why we call this Conversation for Exploration. On these weekly Sunday discussions, we've had a full spectrum of topics: neuroscience, anthropology, archaeology, archaeoastronomy, eco-spirituality, ecology, philosophy, psychology, mythology, shamanism, rituals. The journey goes on and on and on, from the arts to the sciences, and we invite you to visit our website at cuyamongainstitute.com. All of our presentations are free, and as a nonprofit, we invite you to become a supporting member. And of course, we want to thank you, the community members who continue to support the mission of the Cuyamonga Institute. Today, we've all heard the stories about King Arthur of Camelot and the legends where he led British forces along with his trusted Knights of the Round Table in battle against the Saxon invaders in the early 6th century. But was King Arthur an actual person, a simple hero, or a Celtic mythology? That debate's been going on for centuries. Historians are unable to confirm exactly if he existed, but tales and poems depict Arthur as a great warrior, defending Britain not only from human enemies, but also as a magical figure in folklore, defending supernatural enemies as well. And we need to take a fresh look at the tales of King Arthur. And we're due for an update. And today's guest, John Matthews, searched far and wide for the missing chapters, which he includes in his newly published book, The Great Book of King Arthur and His Knights. It includes stories from 32 stories from France, Germany, Italy, Ireland, Iceland, Norway, and of course it all includes a mix of romance, adventure, action, and the magical and the mystical.
We have to ask why the Arthurian stories are so enduring.
Yeah.
And I think for me, one component is that it's not just about the characters. It's not just about Arthur and Merlin and Lancelot and Maid Marian. It's about the era. It's about the era when kingship was more than a political office. It was a spiritual office too, I think. It had to have a mystical element. Dial it back far enough, and the leaders of old had direct lines to the cosmos. They were emissaries of the natural order of the universe. They were expected to have special abilities. And I think that if we, in our scientific era, if we cannot enjoy these stories, if we cannot enjoy a worldview that includes that, if we cannot practice that, we at least can enjoy it as stories with a historical basis, stories that conjure up that worldview in terms of the tales. So I think that this, for me, helps explain why these are so enduring. And we had to go, of course, to Tintagel in one of our trips to England. We had to go see what artifacts there were. We had to go see the sites, at least the stories around the sites around the stories. But our guest today, John Matthews, has such a long and fascinating career, over 100 books written and published since 1980 on the whole Celtic tradition. Again, for us, this is lost history that we just really want to know, that we want to enjoy still. And John's done such a wonderful job of making that so accessible in all of its various aspects. Welcome back, John. You've been with us many a time. Yeah, thank you for this.
Great to be back as always. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your career. You have worked in the film industry as a historical advisor on this. You've made a lifelong study of every aspect of the Arthurian legends, from its origins to its modern retellings. You have done so much. Tell us a bit about why this has been such a draw for you to make this a line of your life's work.
Well, part of the reason really is built into this new book. It feels like I've been writing it all my life. I mean, I discovered the Arthurian legends when I was 15, when I read T.H. White's The Once and Future King, and I loved that immediately, and I knew that somehow this meant something special to me. And that was really what began the whole thing. So it's like I've come a full circle. I have, as you said, spent the last 50 years or so um, studying the myths, the legends, the history, the modern books, the films, the plays, the music. I mean, it goes everywhere, you know. We've had musicals of Camelot. We've had films of every aspect of King Arthur, one of which I worked on. We've had many, many books. I mean, I think the last time I did a count up, there was something like 100 new books a year on Arthur, on various aspects. That's everything across the board.
And a
That's,
lot of movies are a remake or a retelling or a reimagining of a story. So that's endless as
a lot of
well.
them base themselves on the older things, but there are new turns and twists all the time. I mean, the latest one that I read just a few weeks ago is called Spear, by, I'm going to forget her name now, Nicola Griffith. Who's well known for having written a wonderful novel about St. Hilda called Hild. Her version is entirely feminist and very sort of cross-genderal, shall we say, because in this one, the main character, who was taken from the Arthurian legends, would have been Percival, is a woman. So she's turned it all around absolutely wonderfully, and it's one of the best books, one of the best novels about Arthur I've ever read.
Oh, wow.
Things are
Wow.
changing all the time. You know, there are anthologies of cross-genderal, all kinds of shifts in consciousness that seem to be happening. So,
Why is it the enduring? Why is this so replete with so many possibilities, so much attention? We go back to this well again and again and again, culturally. What is it? What's there that
well, I think
gives?
it has something for everybody.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, if you pick up something like Malory's Morte Arthur, which is still recognized as being the collection, if you like, in English anyway, you find everything. You find spirituality, you find love, you find action, you find adventure, you find horror, you find virtually everything that we're interested in, and above all, you find human beings. Because one of the things that I love about Malory, and that prompted me to write my book, which I've dared to call a new Morte Arthur, was because I felt that he had captured something of the spirit of these stories that was absolutely for everyone. I mean, I don't know anybody who hates them.
that's a good point.
I once had a, I once had a dialogue with J.R.R. Tolkien when I was very young,
Oh,
and
wow.
I wrote a fan letter to him, having just devoured Lord of the Rings, and I said, I'm working on the Arthurian legends, and he said, "Oh, don't have much time for those. They're too French." Well, that made me cross because, they're not. A lot of them were written in France by French people. A lot of them were written in Norman French, but Arthur is essentially the English hero. You know, he represents everything that we represent in terms of the land, and he's very much a spiritual entity that is associated with the land. But it goes much deeper than that, because of course you have the Grail myth,
Yeah.
which pushes it right out of just the heroic, the adventurous, or the romantic into the spiritual. And again, I think Malory's version of it is extraordinary. I mean, I should say something more about Malory, perhaps, but maybe we can come to that in a minute. But I just say that he had a limited access to a certain number of books, one of which was a collection that is now called the Lancelot Grail Cycle. And it's 7 volumes. It's huge,
Wow.
but about 60% of it is theology. What Malory did was to take out all the theology and leave the symbolism and the essence and the very power of the story. And that's what he does again and again in his book.
Makes it more accessible, more exciting.
Because it's really the first novel in English, I think. I mean,
Ah,
because it has dialogue, it has character, it has a properly constructed story. It isn't just another kind of account of adventures and magic and so forth. He really pulled it together and made it into a much more human, related thing. And he did most of that while he was in prison.
Oh, wow.
Uh,
What was he doing in prison? I don't know
well,
Malory's story.
let me tell you just a little bit about him. I mean, it's quite hard to talk about Sir Thomas Malory because, in the first place, there are 4 or 5 people with that name.
Uh,
Uh, and some, different scholars will argue different for different Malorys. The one for me is Sir Thomas Malory, who was lived at a place called Newbold Revel in Warwickshire, and he was born either on the 25th of April 1415 or the 22nd of May 1418, depending which version of the documents you like. So he's 15th century, and he was a bit of a wild man, certainly a wild youth. He was imprisoned at various times for all kinds of different things like burglary, assault, even rape on one occasion. Although rape in those days didn't necessarily mean the same thing that it does today. It was often used just for theft. But he was never convicted of any of these things. He was occasionally thrown in jail, and then he got out again. But towards when he was in his late 30s and 40s. He was a soldier, basically, and he fought in the Wars of the Roses, the great struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster that was very similar in some ways to a civil war. And unfortunately, he fought on both sides. He changed sides more than once, but he ended up on the losing side, and so he became a political prisoner and was thrown into prison. And he was in prison for, I think, 10 years.
oh
And
my.
during that time, he wrote his book.
Good
So
occupation.
if
Yeah.
you look at the manuscripts of the book, there are little bits where he says, "Please pray for me, a poor knight in prison," and he's telling you in a way a little bit about himself.
Wow.
So this is the man who wrote this. I mean, I'll show you. This is my edition, which I edited in the year 2000, and
Oh.
as you can see, it's a large book. Um,
Yeah.
2,000 pages.
Yeah.
And it's written in Middle English, so I had to, do modern spellings and change things like that. But this is the heart of the Arthurian mythology as it is today. He took earlier sources, changed them, made them something for the time, and drew upon these books that he had. But he didn't do all of it. He couldn't. So what I've tried to do in my book is to take some of the many hundreds of stories that were not included in there and to put those together to form a new collection. And in order to make it more centralized, more readable, perhaps more connected to people, I invented a medieval scribe who's alive just after Malory, worships Malory, and thinks the book is the most wonderful thing ever. And why didn't Sir Thomas put that story in? And why didn't we have Gawain and the Green Knight? And why don't we have the story of the female knight and so on? So using that as my kind of alter ego, because really it's me, I just then put together this collection, which is, I guess, if you count all of it, it's taken me about 20 years to do, probably longer.
Wow.
Just collecting things. I had to commission some stories to be translated into English for the first time, and then I did my version of it. So
How
they're
did
all
you
my.
find them? What was your detective process to recollect these and identify them as part of the Arthurian tales?
Well, I mean, over the years, having studied it for so long, I've known most of the texts existed. I also have the advantage of living in Oxford, which has the wonderful Bodleian Library, which actually has a few of these original manuscripts. So
Wow.
I was able to go there and study them. I also went to the London Library and studied some more there. And I also communicated with scholars in different countries, asking them about their own tradition and what manuscripts they had and what they knew about the stories. So we ended up with Norse, Icelandic, Spanish, Italian, French, German, all of these different things, that whole mixture together, all under that wonderful umbrella of the Arthurian armor, if you like, you know.
Were these stories that were known but nobody had made the connection, or were they hidden away when you finally got to some of these original manuscripts? Boom, there they were. What made them tied to King Arthur clearly, tenuously? What was the...
Well, they're usually pretty clear as to the Arthurian connection because well, you have to understand that in the main period when all of these stories are written, which is roughly between the 11th and the 15th century, excuse me, is that they you lived in a courtly world where people did not necessarily read. Certainly the poor people didn't read at all. And a lot of the noble people couldn't read either. So what they were always looking for were storytellers. And there were bands of wandering storytellers called conteurs who traveled around Europe and other parts of the world telling stories. And the ones that everyone always asked for, tell me more stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So when they ran out of stories, they made new ones. So you end up, as I say, with something like the Lancelot Grail cycle, which, as I say, 7 volumes. It retells the whole story from before Arthur's birth, right up to his death and departing of this world, as Malory puts it, and in great detail. So when I wanted to choose what to put into this first book, and there will probably be a second and maybe even a third volume, I looked for stories that, well, obviously that Malory hadn't included, but also stories that gave the full range of the Arthurian cycle. So there's a story of a Venable, who is a female knight, a girl who becomes a knight of the Round Table, because no one knows she's a girl, at a time when women were very much in the background. I found a story from the Netherlands called Morte, which is about a black knight, and I mean a knight of colour, not just a knight wearing black armour. And found that extraordinary because, at the time it was written, the Crusades were just about to happen, and people of colour and people of different racial type and belief were not popular. But what's so interesting in this story is that the knights of the Round Table, who are Gawain and Lancelot and all these very famous ones, treat this man Morte exactly as normal. They don't see any racial difference between him and them. He is a brave knight. He is a great seeker of wisdom and adventure, and that's really all that matters to them. So I found new things in here, and the one I'm most pleased about of all is the very last one in the book, which was a story written in Occitan, a very obscure language now, and it was a story it's told in the first person. Now, if you've read medieval manuscripts or read medieval stories, you know that it's quite rare to get first-person narrative that's not history. But this guy, whose name was Guillaume de Tourelle, starts off his story with, "One morning I decided to take a ride. It was a nice day. I got on my horse and went for a ride." He goes down to the seashore. He looks out to sea and he sees a giant whale in the water. And the whale speaks to him and says, "Get on my back. I'm going to take you on a voyage." So he gets on the whale's back and they whiz away across the water, passing islands with strange beasts on them, and arriving finally in Avalon, of all places. Avalon, supposedly the final resting place of King Arthur, right, and the home of Morgan Le Fay and the 9 sisters. So Guillaume gets off the whale, he goes into Avalon, and he meets a couple of people, including Arthur himself. And I won't spoil it by telling you what happens, but it's so unusual because you never hear. You see, Arthur goes off at the end of the story. In Malory's own version, he's wounded, he's put in a boat, they carry him off to heal him of his wounds and say that he will return again one day when his country needs him. You never know what actually happened. You're never told that. This was a story that tells you exactly that. And so for that reason, I absolutely love that one most of all.
Sounds like a spirit journey too, riding on the back of a spirit animal. It
Yeah.
has those mystical elements. So, you have a book coming out about looking for the historical Arthur. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And how do you even separate that out with all these stories?
Well, I've always been interested primarily in the myths. I mean, that's always been the driving force behind everything I've written and studied. But you can't ignore the historical aspect of it because it's such an important part, and people get so excited about it. I mean, if you talk to anyone about Arthur, they'll first of all say, "Did he exist?" And
Right.
I'll say, "Yes, I think he did." A lot of people will say, "No, he's just a myth. These are just legends." That doesn't really matter to me. But it's very exciting to think that there might have been someone who all these extraordinary stories are based on. So my new book, which I co-authored with an American scholar called Linda Malcor, we worked together on a theory that was first proposed way back in the 30s by a philologist called Kemp Malone, who wrote a little article called Artorius, the real Arthur. Now, Artorius was a man, his full name was Lucius Artorius Castus. And Artorius, of course, is the Latin for Arthur. And what was so exciting was that a slab of stone from his mausoleum was found some years ago in Croatia. And the movie called King Arthur, the one that I took part in 2004, the one produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, was based on this theory that Arthur was not a medieval man at all, but a Roman officer who served in Britain, who was stationed on Hadrian's Wall, which is the wall that cuts across, separates south from north, really, to some extent in our country. And the theory is that Artorius was a leader who led a bunch of mercenary soldiers from a tribe known as the Sarmatians, who roughly ran the area of in between the Black and the Red Sea. And they had a big falling out with Rome. There was a huge war, and they lost. And all of their political prisoners were sent to Britain, 1,500 of them. And they were stationed along Hadrian's Wall, and their commander was Lucius Artorius Castus. So that led myself and others to exploring the myths and legends of the Sarmatian people, and particularly one of their subgroups called the Narts, Narts. And in the myths and legends of the Narts, we have all kinds of incredibly familiar scenes. We have a leader with a magical sword who gets his lieutenant to throw it into a lake at the end of his life. We have the people keeping a bunch of these people keeping a sacred object known as the Nartamunga, which is very definitely the Grail. It's another these vessels that act as a connection between this world and the other world, and many other things. Arthur is always said to have fought under a dragon banner. You know, his surname, if you like, was Pendragon. And guess what? The Sarmatians fought under a dragon banner, and in fact, as did a lot of the Roman legions too.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So
that's what the new book's about. Out in November. It's called Artorius, the Roman King Arthur.
okay, November. Noting that.
So I've been looking at history too. I mean, when they approached me to be the historical advisor on the movie, I knew about the theory, but I hadn't really ever investigated it. So, of course, the first thing I did was sit down and look at it because I thought, well, you know, if this is mad, I'm not going to be part of this. But I got very excited by it, and I now feel that there is very, very strong evidence now that this was the first Arthur, and that the Arthurs who came after, because there was definitely more than one,
Yep.
kind of copied that. They kind of went, I think maybe I'll call myself Arthur because that earlier Arthur was extraordinary,
Aha.
and his followers, he had his equivalent of the Round Table back in those days, and the Narts were all called knights. They were the knights of Rome. So you've got an Arthurian character with knights fighting under a dragon banner, people owning a Grail-like object, all kinds of stuff like that. There's much more than that. But when you work out his life history, which Linda and I did, you really feel at the end of that time that, this is a person that you can really believe was the origin of all this.
So if that was then, and that was popular then, and so much, I mean, the accretion starts, right? Where people name it, the stories evolve. So it's had such a long, long, long history. And there is benefit to attaching yourself to something popular like that by name or story. And in fact, Paul, you have, later on, can you show us the slideshow from just a recent news report of, now they've called it Arthur Stone, right? A new find and from the Neolithic era. But again, let's just all call it this, right? Let's attach to this.
Yeah,
so I mean, it
power.
grows, right?
Right,
There's
exactly.
a seed, but then it grows and
It's
grows.
a great
and grows.
marketing plan. Yeah.
A great marketing plan. Yeah, let's look at that. So and it shows you the power of the story and its endurance, right? Its endurance and popularity. It's a testament to that.
Well, I mean, they're calling it Arthur Stone is quite a recent piece of folklore. It's like from the local area, it's become known as that. I mean, for a start, it is very much an ancient tomb, and so obviously it predates any Arthurs by thousands of years.
Right.
But it's the local folklore that's made it interesting. And of course, as soon as you mention the name Arthur, everybody goes, "Oh, really? Really? They're going to find it?"
Right.
Find the
Do
sword?
you want to quickly show that, Paul, since you have that? Yeah, it's just a testament to the endurance of the story.
Absolutely. I mean, you've only got to mention it, and people immediately start to get interested. And I think the archaeologists here are, aware of that fact that they were. You remember that it's called that, and everybody immediately starts wondering what they're going to dig up from there.
Funding, yeah.
But you notice that it said on that little caption there, the legendary medieval king. You see, so he's still a legend, and of course, for a lot of people, he is medieval. This is what's so interesting about the theory I was talking about, that takes him right back to the 2nd century AD. But even if you won't go later than that into the 6th century, which many scholars have studied over the years, it's not medieval quite yet. But it's because of the endurance of those stories that we're talking about here that people in the Middle Ages became so attracted to him. He was listed along with Alexander the Great and various other great characters as one of the 9 Christian worthies. He was that important. People saw him as a figurehead. And this is just gorgeous. I mean, it's a Neolithic tomb. It's fantastic. Probably has nothing whatsoever to do with Arthur at all, but it makes a great story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What about Tintagel? Do you think Tintagel has anything to do with Arthur?
Well, not the castle, because the castle's 11th century, so it's much too late for any real history. I think there's a possibility that there was a connection, because recent years they've done a lot more excavation and discovered that there was a 6th century settlement on the little sort of island, which is right off the promontory of where the main castle is, and it had definitely the foundations of a 6th century, quite influential and important settlement.
Wow.
So again, it's possible. Local tradition says it was Arthur. It was born here. As I say, not in that rather splendid castle, because that was built in the 11th century. But again, the associations are there. I mean, the country is full of those. I mean, you can go into Dosmary Pool in Cornwall and you can find, this is where Arthur threw the sword into the lake. It's a bit of a little muddy lake now, but it has that glamour to it, And up on Hadrian's Wall, I mean, I was fascinated when I went up there to scout out locations and talk with the producers of the show, of the movie. They were amazed at what was there still and what an enormous feat of engineering it was. And it's interesting that that's been associated with Arthur as well for quite a long time.
Well, I have a bit of an Arthur story in my own career. So when I went to go talk to the program director who hired me in radio,
The very first interview.
yeah, I sat down with him, and Brian had just come back from searching for the roots of King Arthur in England. And so he was telling me about this. And I said, I have you. I'm thinking to myself, I have your number. I know that you're going to like the topics that I'm pitching. So I went ahead and pitched and got the job. But knowing that about him, I thought, if you like that, you're going to like what I've got to bring. So, that, yeah,
That
that was
launched your
fun.
career. Yeah.
Launched my career.
Still
So,
get so excited by it, you know.
yeah. So there's that lure, and I think maybe we know more about the medieval period, so it's nice to dress up the story in that era. It's easy, I guess, for people, but that it goes further back, it to me is very intriguing. So
Well,
yeah,
you've got Arthur and Roman looking like a Roman legionary with a Roman cavalry sword, because
yeah,
he and the Sarmatians were all mounted warriors as well. So you have the origin of the mounted knight immediately. But I mean, then you've got the more historical end of things, and then as time goes on, more and more gets added, and each era dresses Arthur or the Arthurian legends in their own costume, if you like. I mean, when you
Sure.
get later on to Victorian times, Queen Victoria and Prince
ah,
Albert used to dress up as King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, and they loved them. And of course, Tennyson, who wrote the great Idylls of the King sequence of poetry, which was a bestseller in its time, made Arthur a Victorian gentleman to all intents and purposes. Yes, he's still in armor and still has a sword and still fights bad knights and dragons and so forth. But really, the moral of the story is very Victorian. So each era discovers Arthur again for its own time.
so when you look at all these different cultures, from the Iceland to France and Spain, I mean, different cultures, but did they add their own onto their own culture, onto these stories? How much did you see of redressing uh,
In a
the Arthurian characters in that culture?
In a way, very little. I mean, there's unity in the medieval world, particularly those countries that seem to have been most excited by the Arthurian legends, that gives a unity to the stories as well. So what happens is names change, and spellings of names change. So
Right.
you have a Welsh character called Owain who becomes Ivan in the Icelandic versions. And you have different names for Gawain, different names for Guinevere. But basically, the characters and above all the situations are very similar. I mean, they're all based around the idea of the quest, of the search for something. Very often it seems little more than adventure, but in fact, then of course you get the Grail, where it's the ultimate search for knowledge, wisdom, and truth. So all of these things are brought in gradually, but there isn't really very much difference in terms of the cultural background. I mean, they'll be dressed in the costume of the time, if you like, and the language, of course, is quite different in that way. But essentially, I mean, the only stories in the book I've done that I had to work on to bring them into the fold of the medieval structure were the Celtic ones, because the Celtic ones are all wilder and much more primitive,
Really?
and all
Yeah.
this kind of much more wild magic going on all the time. And
Okay.
I wasn't going to take that out, of course, but I did have to rearrange or redescribe, for instance, Arthur's court, which is not the sort of rather splendid court of the Middle Ages, but a kind of much rougher one with bards telling stories, with strange beasts and monsters coming into the court, people attacking each other without apparent reason. Um, they're much wilder in tone, and I had to shift that a little bit because I wanted them to have a unity within the book. So I gave myself license to change things a little bit, not too much. And for those of you who are thinking, well, I want to know about the original versions, I did put extensive notes at the back of the book explaining exactly what I changed and, where possible, giving people access to a modern English translation where it exists.
Hmm.
So if you're really into the Arthurian thing at my levels of fascination, and you want to know which of these manuscripts I used or where they are found, or what books are available, then that information is all in the back of the book.
So 32 tales that you found that
32
have
in this
been
one, but there are
included in the
many more, many more. I
many
have
more.
enough volumes. Oh, I've got. I mean, well, I can actually show you in a way. This
Sure.
is
Yeah.
a tower of books here behind me.
Yeah.
Yes.
that one, which goes right down to the floor, or Arthurian texts, all different stories. Some known about, like Gawain and the Green Knight, which I did not put in this book because it's so well known, it's been retold so often. I didn't feel it needed it. But there are many there that are only just now beginning to be edited into modern English. So a lot of French, a lot of German, a lot of Italian in there, and gradually they're coming out. But with this one, in compiling the book, I had to actually commission two to be translated, not in every word, but simply to be summarized, if you like, in English, which then I could make into the story. So you've got some in here that have not been seen in English at all, including that last one I mentioned.
Wow, what a contribution that you've made to this. So do you have Hollywood knocking on your door saying, "Hey, we want to have you advise. We need new fodder to continue the whole Arthur story." That would be logical, would it not? We've got new material. Let's bring it out. Yeah.
I mean, you may be the first person to bring forth this idea of the person of color. And that may be right down Hollywood's lane right now. They'd love to hear that story.
Yeah.
It is a great story anyway. I mean, it's a really what I'd call a typical Arthurian story, but it's about the boy who
Meritocracy and
about his parents, who's my father, who is my mother. His mother was European, his father was Moorish, so he has to set off on a journey to find them. And if you're very good, I'll get Kathleen to come in and read a bit for you. I'd love to read it.
Forward to that. Yeah.
From one of them, anyway.
Tell your agent to get busy.
I just have to go back to one of the original questions Laura asked you, because as you showed us the pile of books behind you, the amount of research and work, the drive and vision that you have, what is the fuel that keeps you going? Because this is a lot of work. This is not some side little project that you do as a hobby. This is your life that you're living.
20-plus year project.
Yeah, I mean, this is your life. And what keeps you going?
Love of the subject, I guess. I mean, I think if you ask anyone who has spent a long time working on a particular area, it becomes so much a part of you. I feel that I know all those characters. I mean, I should explain, and at least one of the people listening in up there, hello David, knows this story, but that I started writing a novel about the Arthurian legends when I was 15. I'm still writing it, and that's a long time. And I began to know the characters. I knew all of the knights by name, and I knew what their characters were, and I knew what the ladies' names were, and who they went out with, and who they were in love with, and who they hated, and all their enemies. And it literally has become a very big part of my life. I mean, I sometimes wonder if I haven't sort of sat here and let everything else float by somehow, but I haven't, of course. But it feels like that sometimes, and I think well, first of all, I would always describe myself. If someone said what word would you use to describe yourself, I would say mythographer. I love myth.
Mythographer.
Because I think myth are the things that drive us to a great extent. So much of our culture, so much of our history, so much of our spirituality is based on myth. And don't ever say to me that myth is a lie, because it's not. There's a great quote from a Roman author whose name I've forgotten at the moment, who said, myth is something, as a story, that has happened, is happening, and will happen.
Oh, I love that.
I've always loved that. So in a sense, for me, when I write these things, I'm looking for what they mean as well, what they mean to us today. Because, it's so easy to dismiss this material, and some people would do so, especially, sadly, the younger ones sometimes would dismiss it because it's just another old story. What's in it? But what I suppose I'm trying to show here, and that's why I did the new book, Malory is wonderful, but very few people who are not very determined and very into this are going to read it. 2,000 pages of Old English. T.H. White once said the Morte d'Arthur was full of the knight's batting averages. that it was how many spears you broke in the lists against your opponent, and how many knights you knocked off their horses and things like that. Not too many people are going to want to read that. So what I thought when this idea came to me about 15 years ago, I thought, well, suppose we could put together a group of stories today that were not in Malory, and I could give them enough energy and enough quality to get people excited. And I hoped I had. I ran this by several friends who said they were good. The best thing of all was when my editor finally got hold of these, it was during lockdown, and he was reading one a day, and he said they helped keep him going through lockdown. And that's when I thought, right, I must have done something good, because that's exactly what I'd like. I mean, they're not page turners like a thriller, but they kind of make you want to know what happens next, and what more could you ask than that, really? And they're great stories. I don't claim to have written them in the true sense, because they're my words, but they were made by someone else, many of whom are anonymous and are long dead. So, what I'm trying to do is bring them up to date, but not by putting them in modern dress or too modern language. I worked very hard to try and get the right balance between old and new. And hopefully I've done that. I don't know, but
This kind of parallels back to the concept Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, that there's something that compels within ourselves, that when we see these stories, we see our own life, that we have that ability to map out ourselves through the human drama and stories. So it plays that kind of a role.
it absolutely does. I mean, I had dialogue with Joe Campbell, and it was extraordinary, because when he heard what it was I was writing about and what I was studying, he got very excited, because he said, I've always loved this. Obviously, even although he didn't write majorly about it, he did write quite a lot about the Grail. But yeah, it is that. It's the hero's journey, and we also how excited people were. I mean, do you remember when that show was shown on TV, the
Yeah.
interview with Campbell? People were turning off their soaps to watch them. Myth. Two old guys talking about myth, I mean, that says something, doesn't it, about how powerful these stories are.
Yeah.
Because they really reflect our worldview and our experience of life, and they're just teaching.
But the way
teaching
that
us.
it crossed all generations, and it captured the imagination on a whole new level, that a PBS
brought us
PBS
into it.
show can have that kind of audience was just absolutely amazing. And yeah,
And look at the reverb today.
still,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, what are some of your favorite stories? What are? Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was only saying thousands of people were tuning in, but yeah, it's really amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Favorite stories? Oh dear, that's a very hard one to answer. I mean,
What's some of the most surprising elements then that really you did not expect, and you're seeing it there?
in compiling this one, I was most surprised by, I think, the story of Venable, the female knight, because I'd not come across this story until fairly recently. And there she is. She's just a girl who's brought up as a boy, and she just wants to do what the boys do. And she's fortunate enough that she runs across Merlin, and Merlin makes it possible for this to happen. And so she's travel and have adventures. She trains with the knights. She's just as strong as they are. She has fantastic adventures. She goes to Rome. She becomes the leader of the guards of the Roman emperor of the time, a medieval emperor, not the traditional one. And she's able to have this whole life. And I mean, this is not a time when women were seen as having a major role. Of course, one of the things that you do understand straight away when you read more and more of the Arthurian stories is that most of the energy for the stories actually does come from women. They're usually fairy women, it's true, but they're there. It's Morgan Le Fay, it's Guinevere, it's Melusine, it's the Lady of the Lake. It's all of these who hide behind, if you like, or are not seen in the forefront of the story, but they're always there. There's a couple of stories in here that will surprise you, I think, when you see just how powerful these otherworldly women are. I'll tell you just a tiny bit of one. It's called The Visit of the Grey-Hammed Lady, and it's one of the Celtic ones. And it's this mysterious woman turns up at King Arthur's court and is greeted and made welcome and is friendly with everybody. And she has a secret that behind one of her knees is a tuft of grey hair. And she tells this to one of the other women and said, swears at secrecy. But guess what? The other woman goes and tells someone else, and next minute the whole court is looking at her and going, she's got a tuft of grey hair. And so this makes her very angry. And then they discover that she is an otherworldly woman, because she said, right, because of this, I'm going to enchant all of the knights, all of the men in the court, and take them away, leaving you women without anyone. And she does just that. See, all the knights are kind of, and then she just takes them away, and they go off to the other world, and in the other world they all meet beautiful fairy women and fall in love with them. And then after a time, there's some adventures, won't spoil the story, but after a time, after various adventures, he learns that they're okay, really. They're just men. They can't help it, but they're okay. And then she lets them all come back to the court, and everything goes on as before. But it's just this, you don't think that. You don't expect that kind of storytelling in the Middle Ages to have that power, but it does. There are quite a few in this book like that.
Yeah.
So it's another strand, you see. There's so much in there. I mean, you name a thing that you're interested in. Well, let's not say, modern motor racing or something like that. But I mean, if you name a deep subject that means something to you, I guarantee somewhere there'll be an Arthurian story that will help you understand that or focus on that. So,
What are some of the more spiritual aspects that were surprising, that said something new that you didn't expect?
Not so much with that, because the Grail story is obviously the central one. And I found some different versions of it. And there's some very interesting different versions. The story of Percival, for instance, is best known from the 12th century version by Chrétien de Troyes. There are earlier versions than that, which make it more universal, I think, if that's the right word for it. It shows just how deep it is, just how powerful this is, because it's not just a bunch of knights setting out on a quest. It's a gradual realization of just how powerful and important it is to connect to something bigger than yourself.
Right.
To the universe, to the cosmos, to God, whatever you wish to name it, goddess, anything that has that quality that is transcendent.
That's the heart of the hero journey.
Out of it. That's where it all is, I mean, I found, well, one of the stories that I've retold in here, Kathleen and I actually wrote a book about this a couple of years ago called The Lost Book of the Grail, and it focuses on a text known as the elucidation, the elucidation, which it is not, because it doesn't elucidate anything. It's completely mysterious and curious. It says, this is an introduction to all the Grail stories, and I'm going to explain to you, the author says, what it's all about. But he doesn't. He tells you a completely different story. And in this story, you have the damsels of the wells, and they have cups that they come and they serve travelers with food and water and rest and peacefulness. And then there's a bad guy, of course, there has to be. Evil King Amangons comes along, sees all these beautiful fairy women looking after the wells, leaps in there with all his men, there's nasty scenes of rape, steals the cup, goes away, and time passes. And then it's Arthur's time. And Arthur and his men get to hear about this. And they go, this is terrible. We must find this Amangons and his men and destroy them because of what they did. Then, of course, they realize that it was so long ago that Amangons and his men are all long dead. And that now, in the forest where they find the descendants of these people, these are the offspring of the attack. These are children born of that horrible moment who themselves are now forming a kind of company of the Grail and guarding these sacred cups. So it's a completely different version of the Grail myth, but it works so well.
It works so well.
A text that had hardly ever been looked at. So Kathleen and Gareth Knight did a new translation, and then together she and I wrote the book, and went into all the background of it. But that story is in my book too. Yeah.
Do we have questions, comments? We're going to have a reading as well, an excerpt.
Well, speaking of Kathleen, I mean, this is another aspect to your life, and that is that you have this partner, this wife, this equal researcher and person on this journey with you, and it's quite an amazing how the two of you work together. You've published so much together, and yet you both have independent projects as well. So it's quite an amazing journey. And
We applaud the husband-wife
we always
teams.
applaud the couples that can work together and stay married for many, many, many years.
Easy, but we managed. We do the best we can, and in fact, I think it's done more to bind us together, than because it was that interest that brought us together in the first place. When I first met Kathleen, it was in a library. We both worked in a library. You'd be surprised to hear. And I was sitting in the staff room talking about the Mabinogion. And in comes this wonderful woman whom I was absolutely smitten by at first, saying, "Oh yeah, I know all about that," And so we sat down and had a conversation, and that, as they say, was the beginning of the romance and the life we've shared together. So it's totally my other half.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we invite her in and let's have her do a reading, and if she's available, and I think it'll be fabulous.
Right. So I'm going to ask her. I'll just let me fill you in with the story a little bit, just to put it in context. This
Sure.
story that I've asked her to read is called "The Adventure at Tarn, Waffling," which is actually a place in the north of England, and it's really a ghost story. Another thing that you have in the Arthurian legends, it's a ghost story, and on this particular occasion, King Arthur and Sir Gawain and Queen Guinevere have all gone off hunting, and Arthur gets separated. He's off chasing the stag, and so it's just Guinevere and Gawain. I'll go and fetch my good lady. Well, hang on a moment.
Good job.
Hello, Kathleen.
Good to see you.
There you go. Okay.
Great. Okay, so here we go.
I've explained where it starts. So after you,
The Adventures of Tom Waffling. And there they witnessed a strange and terrible vision. The sky, which had been fair until that moment, turned suddenly dark at midnight. Rain began to fall heavily, turning swiftly to sleet, and then in moments to snow. And the Queen and Sir Gawain hurried to take what shelter they could beneath the trees, and from there they saw something frightful arising from the waters of the Tarn. Human in shape, though bony and wasted, shreds of clothing, clods of earth, on what might have been rotten flesh, clung to it. It rose into the air and advanced across the water, shrieking and yammering like one in torment, all the while wringing its hands. "A curse! A curse!" the vile thing screeched. "A curse upon the body that bore me! Because of my life, my suffering consumes me." It made straight for Gawain and the Queen, who backed away from it in fear, and Guinevere cried aloud and raised her hands in horror. "Oh, this must be caused by an eclipse of the sun," Sir Gawain said, hoping to calm the Queen's fears. "I have heard that strange things may happen at such times, and I will speak with this creature and try to find out what it wants. Perhaps I can calm it." Inwardly quaking, Gawain approached the edge of the tarn where the creature now hung stationary. It seemed confused, staring madly before it. Its eyes were like hollow pits, red and glowing, and as he approached, Gawain saw with revulsion that a toad crouched in the hollow of its throat, and that snakes crawled around its wasted body. Gawain drew his sword, and though he doubted it would be of any use against such a thing, he demanded to know what kind of business the spectre had with them. The ghost's jaw and all its body began to shake as though it would fall apart, and Gawain called upon God to protect him, and again demanded to know what the fell being wanted and who or what it was. Gradually the shaking and the shivering ceased, and the red eyes turned upon the face of Gawain. "Once I was the fairest of women," it said in a low, grating voice. "Kings were among my ancestors. Now I am come to this. And so I have come to speak with your queen, for once I was a queen myself, more fair than Isolde, or even Mariol, the bride of Torak. Treasure and beauty were mine, and I had power over vast lands. But now I am lost, exiled in eternal cold. Pain entraps me, and I lie at night in a bed of coldest clay. See then, what death has done to me, Sir Knight, and bring your lady hither, that I might speak with her. Moved to pity by this fearful account, Gawain returned to where the queen stood, shivering with cold and fear. Lady, he said, the spirit would speak with you, though it is a fell thing. I think it means us no harm. Drawing her cloak closely around her, Guinevere advanced at Gawain's side to the edge of the Tarn, and looked with horror at the spirit. Welcome, Queen Guinevere, the apparition said in its low and unearthly voice. Look what death has done to me. Once I had roses in my cheeks, and skin soft as the lily. How easily I laughed. Now I am brought down to this, tied to this spot with invisible chains, and for all the youth and loveliness and power you now possess, in time you will become as I am now. As shall every king and queen now living. Death will bring you to this, have no doubt. And then the spirit, trembling and rattling, edged nearer. Its red eyes glared at the queen. Do you not know me? Guinevere forced herself to look more closely at the apparition. Truly, she said, I do not believe so. For a moment the spirit hung still. Then it rose up high into the air and flew across the tarn and back, shrieking all the while, coming to rest close to Sir Gawain and the queen so that they could smell the odour of the grave. It spoke again. Guinevere, once I was your mother. The queen turned pale and raised her hands to her cheeks. Tears coursed down her face, and her breath came almost as raggedly as the vision. Scarcely able to stand, so that Sir Gawain moved closer to catch her if she fell, the queen answered, Are you truly my mother? To which the spirit replied grimly, I am she that bore you, and by this shall you know it. Once I broke a vow which only you and I know of. This chills my blood, said the queen at last. What can I do to ease your pain? Are there masses to be said or prayers to be offered that will help you find rest? Prayers melt in the air like dew, and all the wealth of the world goes away at last, intoned the spirit dolefully. Perhaps, if enough masses are said, I shall indeed find rest, but more important than this are the deeds you can do while you are yet living. Offer mercy to those who need it. Give food to the needy. These things alone will help me, as they will help you in time to come. Remember, life is brief. Gawain, silent all this while, now spoke up. May I ask, said he, what destiny awaits those who, like myself, must fight in battles and warfare, who invade lands not rightfully theirs and may massacre those who deserve to live? The apparition turned its red eyes upon him. Your king is greedy as are all kings. All the lands he reaches out towards fall to his hand. King Ban and King Arran are dead, and many others with them. In time to come even Rome itself shall bow the knee to Arthur. Yet his end shall come sooner than he would wish, and at the height of his powers he shall be laid low on the shore of the sea. The goddess of fortune shall turn her wheel against him. The creature paused and seemed to be seeking new strength to continue. Gawain had grown pale as the words it spoke. Now it addressed him further. I tell you this, Sir Gawain, you should leave here now. One is coming who shall challenge you at Carlisle. Who knows if you will survive his coming? At this Sir Gawain stood back. Fear rose within him for all his courage, and the spirit rose high into the air again and declared, Soon others will come who will bring sorrow and strife to Britain. You, Sir Gawain, shall die in a steep valley at the hand of one you now call friend. Arthur himself shall fall in Cornwall, slain by one who carries a shield of sable with a saltire engrailed in silver upon it. And now this, This one is but a child playing at ball, but he shall grow to manhood and shall conquer all. And on that day the fellowship of the Roundtable shall perish, and the dream of Camelot the goldenness shall end. This is all I can say. Remember me. Hold these things in your hearts. And the spirit's voice trailed away mournfully, and a most terrible silence fell. And if you want to find out more, you'll have to find out from me.
Oh, thank you so much. Delightful.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back
Thank
to
you
you all.
so much.
Cliffhanger.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
I heard Rome mentioned in there.
I wasn't expecting the voices and the, I keep forgetting Kathleen trained as an actress, so, the full bloke here,
Yeah, indeed.
kind of story. You see what I mean now, that you never quite know what's going to happen next. Who's expecting a ghost story in the middle of the stories of Camelot? And yet what the Queen says and what she's promising will happen, of course, comes to be. So, this was a story written in the 14th century by an anonymous English author. It's one of the few English ones in the book, but it has that wonderful kind of strength and energy. And Tarn, Waffling is a real place. So if you're looking for a ghost story, go to Tarn, Waffling.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah, interesting. So you talk about romance and adventure, and do you want to share a few others?
Other stories?
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to quote a little bit from one of the ones I like as
Yeah.
well.
Go do
Uh,
that.
Not just for storytelling, but there's, as I said, it's almost impossible to really account for all the variety of these stories. There is, as I said before, something for everyone in there, more or less. It's the range of it is extraordinary. I would think that, the one I'd like to quote to you, a little short piece, is actually one of the ones about Merlin. Now, we all think we know about Merlin, the great magician who is, Arthur's advisor and all of that, and then mysteriously disappears.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another story, another version that is less well known, written long before Malory, in the 12th century, by a writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote a book called The History of the Kings of Britain, which is generally considered to be pseudo-history now, but which, in fact, for the first time, set out a story of Arthur, a kind of coherent whole. And so successful. This was the bestseller. This was like the Dan Brown of the time, it literally
Of his
romped the
time.
copies. And this is a time when, books were hand printed, so, it was quite something. And so popular was it that, of course, he looked around for another story, and he said, "Oh, I know, I'll do Merlin." So he did one, the Vita Merlini, or the Life of Merlin, and it's very extraordinary, very different in tone in many ways. And in this one, Merlin is a prince of the Welsh who fights in a battle, and after the battle he goes mad because he sees many of his friends fall in battle. He sees three young men who had been great friends all killed before his eyes, and so he goes mad, and he runs off into the forest, and he lives in the wilds of the forest, eating nuts and berries and talking to animals. Eventually, as time passes, and he is captured and taken to the court and behaves so madly that they let him go again. On one of these visits, he re-encounters his wife, who says, "Look, are you ever coming back, really?" And he goes, "No." So she says, "Well, may I marry again?" And he said, "If you want to, yes, of course." So plans go ahead for the wedding, and Merlin gets an invitation, and this is what happens. Meanwhile, the prophet continued to live in the wilderness, loving the forest more than he had ever loved life in cities and courts. One night, as he was sitting beneath the trees, gazing up at the horned moon and bathing in the glory of the bright stars, he fell to thinking of Gwendolina, that's his wife, and wondering if she still remembered him or had found peace in the arms of another. As he watched the stars, he saw signs that indicated that she was to marry again, and he thought back to his words at their parting and how he had promised to bring her gifts, and this he determined to do. Next day he arose and went through the woods, gathering a great herd of stags and goats, does and she-goats, which he shepherded into a long line. He himself rode at the head of this strange column on a great stag. He set out for the place where Gwendolina was about to marry, just as the stars had foretold, and he arrived at the gates and called out her name. When she came forth, she was amazed at the sight of Merlin and the great herd of creatures he had brought with him. Her bridegroom, whose name the story does not remember, was standing at a high window. When he saw the ragged, hairy wild man mounted on the stag's back, he burst out laughing. Looking up, Merlin saw this, and sudden wild anger filled his heart. With terrible strength he seized the antlers of the great stag, on whose back he sat, and wrenched them off. Then he flung them at the window, so that they struck the bridegroom's head, crushing it and the life within him, and sending forth his spirit upon the wind. At this there was a great outcry. Merlin drove his heels into the stag's side, and made off at full speed, pursued by soldiers. Such was the speed of the stag that Merlin would have found refuge in the forest, had they not had to cross a river. But when the stag stumbled and Merlin fell into the water, striking his head, so that for a time his wits deserted him. In this way his pursuers caught him and brought him back to the court to be placed in the care of his sister.
Yeah.
So don't invite your ex to your marriage. Your wedding is, I think, is the answer.
Well, I'll put a picture of the cover of your book up here.
Thank you.
It's right here.
Yeah, speaking
Yeah.
of Merlin.
Yeah. So that's right. Yeah.
So,
There's the book. Of course, we didn't have images from interior because they asked you not to do that, but we wanted to at least.
well, I have a question.
Well, I will tell you,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll tell you that the pictures by John Howe, who most people will know of as the one of the artists who worked on the Lord of the Rings films, and created some of that wonderful stuff. And I think I'm allowed to hold up the book and show you. Here's one. This is Percival going on in search of the White Boar. There are 15 plates in this book by John, and lots of black and white pencil sketches. They're absolutely gorgeous. I've known him for years. He's always planned to work together, and we finally managed it. So while he was off helping them create this new series based on the Lord of the Rings, he was also doing pictures for me, which is great.
Oh, wow. So you commissioned these just for the book. So.
Perfect.
Publishers did. The publishers commissioned it. But so I don't know if he's out there listening. You can use hello and thank you, but we'll see.
So you have come and talked with us about fairies and your own encounters with the fairy realm, and there's fairies in these stories. You've mentioned some of them. What new insights about this long-standing covenant between the fairy realm and the human realm, and the powers and the roles of fairies do you find in the legends?
How long have you got? This is such a giant question. I mean, well, I've worked with beings, if you like, that I call fairies. I've studied the work of the fairy people in literature and in vision over many years, almost as long as the Arthurian, in fact. And I found, well, the story that I have is that they want to work with us because they share the same space that we do. We can't see them most of the time, but they live in a different dimension, but it's a dimension that overlaps this one. And we kind of meet in the middle. And the first thing that I was told when I started this work was, if we, human beings, were not careful, we would damage their world with what we were doing to ours. So we're not just looking at all the things that we're doing to harm the planet right now, we're looking at what we may be doing to harm other dimensions as well. And that's been the focus of a lot of work I've done over the last 15 years. along with various colleagues, including David Spangler, who's watching, who's
Ah,
also
hi,
doing
David.
some of it, and and others. It's become a bit of a, I work with a particular branch of them, if you like, called the She,
She.
and there are a lot of people out there, spelled Sidhe, it's Irish. A lot of people out there who are working with this material now, and who were working before I started doing it as well, but have sort of picked it up since then. So yeah, I mean that continues to be part of my other hat work, if you like, the more practical work.
Right.
With this book, I get to wear my storyteller's hat, which is still one that I feel is most me in some ways.
Very cool.
So, um,
Well,
David, I want to talk to David.
David, do you want to make a comment? We'll put you up on screen.
Yeah,
Add to the conversation.
we've interviewed you long ago.
Yeah.
Hi.
Connor.
Hello, everybody. Hi, John. It's so wonderful to listen to you this morning. This was special. Makes my day.
Thank you.
Of course, it's morning here where I am. Yeah, I agree. This whole aspect of understanding the relevance of other dimensions. In our society, we just put that off as fantasy and as unreality, but we really do inhabit a much larger world than most people fully understand or accept. And I think that's one of the powers, as John was saying, that myth has, and that the Arthurian stories in particular have, is that they are a way of introducing us to the reality of that larger dimension. But at the same time, people like John have their contacts with that world today. It's not like this exists only in the medieval times or in the early centuries or pre-Roman time or Neolithic times. It's happening right now. The great quests are happening every day for us as we seek the grail of a healed world and a better world and a harmonious world. We're all really enlisted as knights, and the world is our round table. So I think in that sense, Arthur means a lot to all of us as a way of inspiring a deep remembrance of why we're here and what we're called to do. And John, you are somebody that has held the torch of this so high for so many years, and it's just been a privilege to work with you and to know you as a friend.
Yes.
Oh, and with you, David, thank you. I mean, you remind me, of course, that one of the things that Merlin says to Arthur right at the beginning of the story, when they talk about creating a round table, Arthur says, "Why round?" And Merlin obviously doesn't go, "Well, obviously, because then everyone's equal." He goes, "It is round like the world."
Yeah.
So that's exactly it. The round table is in a sense the world, and we're all knights in it. Yeah, definitely.
Back to the
So
heroes
thank you
journey.
for your kind thought too.
Thank you, David. Yeah.
So maybe that's
Great
why,
input.
as I was saying, the myths are our way to, if we can't do this in our scientific age directly, at least we can imbibe this through the legends. We seek to remember that time, that there's more to our world than we know. And that was long known by our ancestors, right? Long known. So,
Well, David Hicks has his hand up. David, you want to ask your question or comment?
Hi. Well, I have two questions, and one of them is a burning question I've had since I was a teenager, which is, do changes in our world experience affect the other world? For example, would climate change or something to that effect have an impact on characters in the other world?
Very much, I think. I mean, this again, funny enough, this takes me back to riding around Seattle with David many years ago, with one of my sort of inner helpers, as it were, sitting in the back. And David said, "Why doesn't he appear? Why isn't he visible to everybody, you know?" And I said, "Well, I'll ask him." So I did, and he said, "Because if I appeared, or if my fellows appeared, then all of you would want to come through to my world with your big boots, and you would destroy it." So I think this was a warning that's developed since then, in the sense that, as I say, we occupy the same space. It's a different dimension, it's a different level, but it is the same space. And I think that when we cause damage here, we are threatening that other world, which is very important to us. I mean, why are so many people drawn to these places and these times and these beings if they were not important? If they were nothing, if they were just frivolous or pointless or imaginary, then we'd ignore them. But we don't. We work with them if we can, and we listen to what they have to say, and they're full of wisdom. So yes, absolutely. We do, I think, what we do here affects them, and perhaps what they do there affects us. I'm not so sure about that, but there is an interplay, certainly.
That is something the founder of our institute's always said, that this realm and that realm are two sides of the same coin. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there's been a long-standing means and ways of communicating and exchanging energy, exchanging wisdom.
And your second question, David?
So my second question is a little more convoluted, sorry. Ever since reading Immanuel Velikovsky's Mankind and Amnesia, where he talks about how cataclysmic events may have caused our race to have amnesia about what happened in the past, and that we have a tendency to self-destruct because of that. I've looked at myth a little differently, and I look at the Arthurian myths as kind of the warrior hero, the conqueror. They're either fighting to conquer or fighting to survive, kind of thing. And that seems to be what a lot of our movies pick up on. I mean, sword fights are way more exciting than planting gardens and that kind of stuff as far as cinematography goes. I was wondering if you had insights on what aspects of the Arthurian myths would you like to see promoted more that related to the healing of the planet or more connection to the spirit realm and that sort of thing?
Well, I think that at the heart of the story is a great tragedy, and that is that when the greatest challenge that the Round Table has is the quest for the Grail. The Grail appears in Camelot, floating in a sunbeam, and everybody gets up and they all say, "We're going to go on quest." They don't even think about it. They feel that this is the ultimate goal. And they all set off, and very few of them return. Most of them get lost along the way. And actually, going back to Sir Thomas Malory, he says a very significant line when Arthur sits and watches the last of the knights leaving. He said, then he shook his head in sorrow. I'm not quoting from word for word. He shook his head in sorrow because knights he had had aplenty, but now he had none, and he knew that many of them he would not see again. So in a way, what is the sadness that's at the heart of the story is that it is that quest that breaks the Round Table. It's the human dilemma of trying very hard to get to a point of understanding, to a point of wisdom, and failing because of all kinds of different things, the pressures of the outer world, the greed, the selfishness, all the things that we know about, and indeed the fact that many people deny the existence of global warming, even though right now we're seeing temperatures hit an all-time high. All of this is part of the human condition, I suppose, to give it a big term. And I think the stories of the Round Table reflect that for us. They may not have reflected it as much for the people who read and listened to the stories at the time, but I rather suspect that Malory, at least, as a soldier, someone had fought in a terrible war, an internecine war of one side fighting another, that he also saw that at the heart of the story, it all goes wrong. You know, there's Lancelot and Guinevere, and Lancelot and Guinevere have said all through time in the stories, they all say they love each other, but they're not going to consummate their love. And when they finally do, well, even Malory doesn't tell us for sure. He says, I don't know what went on that night, but we assume. That breaks the table finally, because then there's warfare between the Lancelot and Gawain and Galahad and Gaheris and Gareth and all of the rest of them taking sides in this. And then that allowed Arthur's son Mordred to come along and smash the rest of it and take over and mortally wound his father. So yeah, there's so much human drama in there and human feelings. I think that's another of the reasons that empower it. I don't know if that answers your question. It's the best I can manage.
Actually, it answers it beautifully, I think. Yeah.
Thanks.
The eternal struggle.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, I did have one more question.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Go for it.
Yeah. Have you read Stephen Lawhead's Arthurian series, and if so, what did you think of his take on it?
Well, Stephen used to live only half an hour away from me here in Oxford for quite a long time. And I'll tell this story because this really did happen. I went along to a gathering of children's writers, authors, and I really did want to meet him. And I took my son, who was about 9 or 10, because I knew he had children and that he would be bringing his children. And I thought it would be great, the children could meet. But I'm afraid I got very cold welcome, in that he didn't want, to have anything to do with me or my kid because we were pagan and he's very Christian.
Yes.
That doesn't bother me. I read the books. I enjoyed the books enormously. I felt that at times he kind of perhaps wore his colours a bit, perhaps more than he needed to. But what is so interesting about them is, as I don't know if you found this, but as you read them, you see that he's moving over, kind of being more sympathetic towards what you might have called the other side, if you like. So there's much more sympathy for the pagan ways, if you like, by the third book. Fourth book? I can't remember now. There are 3 or 4. Anyway, yeah. So I enjoyed them. I enjoyed them enormously, with a few caveats, but on the whole, I loved it.
I had some issues with the Christianization that he introduced in a lot of his.
Little bit.
Stuff.
I mean,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So maybe part of the Arthurian legends is a repository of the old ways moving forward into a society that became A, more Christian over the centuries, and B, more secular at the same time. Interesting, right?
Well, I mean, I think Arthur, assuming that he did exist, certainly the Lucius Arturus Castus probably wasn't Christian. The 6th century Arthur might have been, but probably not. So it's very interesting that as the time passed and as the medieval writers discovered him and began to tell these stories, he became the Christian king. And as I said, he ends up being one of the 9 Christian worthies, along with Alexander the Great, who, as far as I remember, was definitely not Christian, and a few other characters who were not either. But they looked at them as being the great. They were the superheroes of their time. I know you had someone talking about this a few weeks ago. And, it's like, I find it very interesting, too, that 1 or 2 of the more recent superhero movies, and I'm a great fan of them, have picked up on this. So, for instance, in the Transformers series,
Oh, yeah.
my friend Mark Ryan did the voice of Bumblebee. The last one that they made was completely Arthurian. It turns out that the robots were actually original Knights of the Round Table. So there you go. Who would have thought? But it worked.
We just interviewed Douglas Woke
Right.
about the superheroes and the heroes of old and making comparisons. That was fun. He read like all the Marvel comic books.
20,000.
Yeah. So they were the superheroes of their day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very.
Fabulous. Justin has a question. Hi, Justin. I'm going to put you up. Here we go.
Hi, Justin.
Hi, John. Hey, this is fascinating. Really glad to have come across this talk because coincidentally, I actually just had began Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain,
Right.
and I'm nowhere near the Arthurian, section, timeline and history yet. But I'm curious about, it says, I believe, but in the translator's preface, something about during, I believe it would have been during the time of the Saxon invasion, that there was a split of the population of the, I don't know if they would be considered indigenous, but of the Britons, Britons. Is that, I don't know if that's factual or not, but you mentioned something earlier about the comment about, Arthurian legend being very French. So I'm just wondering if there was this sort of emigration at, in those times, how that might have affected kind of things, as far as cultural, historical record.
Well, yes, I know. I mean, I understand now. I thought, that you were saying that there was a disagreement, as it were, that one side was following one and the other was following some other path. But no, that didn't happen. But what happened? Well, I mean, you have to remember that after the Romans left, you had a bunch of Celtic tribes all struggling for supremacy and fighting with each other, which is what was happening before the Romans came. So it's like everything went back to normal, except that now we had these incomers coming over from Germany and various other countries along that coastline and trying to invade. And what the Arthur of that time seems to have done is to unite those tribes together to form a force which he led. It's very clear in the earliest references to Arthur, which are a few hundred years earlier than Geoffrey, says Arthur was not a king but a leader of men. In fact, he was the Duke of Battles, Dux Bellorum. And so he was a soldier. He was a soldier, obviously, of great power, who brought together these feuding peoples to defend the country. But what happened is interesting, because quite a lot of them went abroad. You're right about that. They escaped the country and they went to Brittany, first of all, and then into France, or Gaul, as it was at the time. And there they encountered the storytellers who were at that point busy telling stories of their own heroes and heroines. And when they heard the Arthur legends, they went, oh, these are good. So the storytellers picked up those and they turned them into courtly romances, into what Tolkien thought was too French. They Frenchified them. They made them, no insult to the French, by the way. I have some wonderful French friends. But they made them more courtly. They made them again. They dressed them in the armor and the costumes of the time, and made them much more French and much more developed in a sense of the storytelling techniques. But what happened back in Britain was that Arthur, or the leader of the people, gathered everyone together, and they fought off the Saxons. And they basically pinned them down around the eastern coastline of Britain and part of the south. And they pinned them down there for so long that they kind of settled. And they also intermarried with British women. And so what came out of this was what became known as the Anglo-Saxons, the English Saxons, if you like, those who combined both elements. So in a way, apart from defending the land, as Arthur did, he also helped in the foundation of the future of this country. And the stories, meanwhile, migrated into France, from there into Germany and Italy and Spain, and other European countries, and it spread out from that point. So, does that make it understandable for you? Is that good?
Yeah, very clear. Yeah, you really covered all of that. My question wasn't terribly pointed or metaphysical, but I think the history is fascinating.
Well, the
Just
early
to
part
hear.
is quite interesting too, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people skip it because they go, "Well, no, I want the Arthur bit," and they'll jump right through the first two books. But there's a lot about, the founding of the country by giants and how the grandson of Aeneas of Troy came to Britain and founded the country, whose name was Brutus, and so Britain was called Bruton, and then Britain. I mean, all those stories are very interesting. I have another book on the way about that at some point. Very interesting stuff.
Well, talking about interesting people coming, right, to this part of the world, and talking about the Christianization of the myths and talking about the Grail, what do you think of all the stories about Joseph and Mary going from the Holy Land over to England and settling because they were da da da? What do you think of all those histories, personally?
That's a big one.
What do you think?
Again, it's a huge topic. You need.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've got to answer in two ways, in a sense, because I've always been interested in the Joseph Arimathea story, and I've done quite a lot of research into it. And there is such a very strong tradition in Cornwall that Joseph did come here, that he was trading in tin, and the best tin mines in the world were in Britain. So there is a possibility of that. There's very little historical evidence to suggest that he was Jesus' uncle, although that's what everyone says he was, and that certainly there is almost nothing, that much maybe, evidence to suggest possibly that Jesus could have come with him, because we don't know what happened in those years between, being a boy and being a man. There's a gap. So he could have been here. But it's very much a question, I think, for personal belief that. What is interesting is that in recent years, what's come out of all this is some very interesting stories about the origins of Christianity itself. I've been partly involved in this with some friends of mine who are investigating a series of books that were discovered in the desert, made of sheets of lead. And these tell a story. You may have had David Elkington on your show.
Yes.
Yeah, well, then you know what I'm talking about, but I'm not sure everyone else will. But anyway, they are being investigated and have now been proved to be ancient through tests and so forth. And they do present a very different version of the origin of Christianity. Figure, in a way, they bring in the Grail material to a great extent. And there's even one of them that has, David may have shown you, I don't know, but there is one that shows the set of the 4 sacred objects: the spear, the cup, the stone, and I'm going to forget the dish. That's right, which are the 4 elements that are shown often in the Grail stories, and they are shown as surrounding the figure of Christ. So there's some interesting stuff there.
Yeah.
It will take a long time.
As a separate interview, but fabulous. Thank you, Justin, for
Yeah.
jumping in and asking your questions.
Thank you. Excuse me, but what is the last name of the investigator you just mentioned?
Oh, David
David?
Elkington.
You'll hear more from David soon.
Yeah, Elkington.
Yeah.
Elkington.
Thanks.
David's fascinating, and we've got some interviews posted on the YouTube channel.
We have several.
For CI. Yeah. So.
I should warn you, if you're going to look it up, that you will see a lot of pretty unpleasant stuff, because of what he's claiming is not popular, especially among some groups. So if you look online,
pushing some buttons,
a lot of anti-material, but it's beginning to go off because now, the proof is here. Lots of people said they were fakes. Now that it's been proved that they're not, and so people are now starting to look to see what they genuinely are. So there we are. But it's a contentious one, I will say. But thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, Justin.
Thanks, Justin. I want to ask, so kings, besides their political role, their military role, they also, if you go back early in time, and not kings, but just say leaders, had a spiritual role, kings and queens. Could you speak to the expectation, and maybe this is their shamanic role, right? That they were liaisons between earth and heaven. Can we talk about what leaders used to be back in the day, right? They had the expectation, like in Camelot, the queens were expected to be hands-on healers. They were expected to have some connection to the divine. I think that's very interesting that we used to consider that they had to be spiritual leaders as well. You go back to the earliest concepts of kingship, queenship. Could you speak to that?
Gosh, you've saved up all the big questions for almost the end, haven't you? I would say that, the idea of the divine king and the divine right of kings, which of course got our Prince Charles I into trouble for believing too literally, is something that's a very big point. I mean, the problem with this has always been that unless you go right back to the beginning, if you go back to Solomon and you go back to the great early leaders of their time, not all of them were obviously good or spiritual,
Right.
and it's always been a question of, can you get the kingly power? Can you have power and spirituality? And it seems as though in many cases a lot of the kings who have been offered spirituality have turned away from it. One of the things that I've been researching a lot just recently are the legends of Prester John, who is this mysterious figure, again medieval figure, who is supposed to have had a Christian kingdom somewhere in the distant Far East behind what would then have been considered enemy lines at the time of the Crusades. And there are stories about letters being sent by him to the kings of Europe, and letters being sent back to him. And there's a strong connection with the Grail in that I've just recently uncovered. But it's almost as though the real kings don't measure up.
Right.
I mean, can you name me one king who you can think of who really
They're human.
become human? Well, they were human, yes, but did they ever become spiritual human beings?
Yeah.
This is the thing. I can't think of one. They were all
But I
flawed in
mean,
some way
the
or other.
expectation way back. I mean,
Oh, the
even,
expectation.
you look at Queen Elizabeth's coronation, there's the drop of oil, there's this mystical imparting, there's a stepping up to some divine role, right? There's that inkling in the myth, in the story, in why does somebody get to rule? What are the qualities that what is the robe around which what is the mantle? There's that thread. There's
Well,
that
yes,
thread
they're
that's
also
there.
they're all taking on that mantle in many ways.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth is probably one of the very few who, by no means, was perfect. I mean,
She
she
tried to
didn't
live up to it. Yes, that's why we admire her.
the
Yeah.
queen. You could say our current queen here is pretty good too, and she takes it very seriously. That role
Yeah.
of being, blessed into the kingship, into the queenship, took very, very seriously, and others have in the past. But what you think of when you see history is that very few are able to hold that
Right.
in a way. As I say, the idea that the king is somehow appointed by God, which is not one that's held, I think, anywhere in the world now. But when it was, very few people measured up to it. And
Right.
this, I think, is why you had to have figures like Arthur. Coming back to this, you may actually have answered your original question, which is why the Arthurian legends are so important, because they represent something that we aspire to, that we don't always reach. I mean, look again at the quest of the Grail. The Knights of the Round Table are supposed to be good men. They follow the rules of chivalry. They're brave, and they're supposedly honest, and the rest of it.
Yeah.
And yet they almost all fail. The only one who doesn't fail is Galahad and his two companions, Percival and Bors. And Galahad is literally the perfect knight. He is literally every man. He is saintly, in fact. But the rest of them are all human. Lancelot himself, the great knight, the champion of Guinevere and of the Round Table, fails. And he says, he is told by an angel that he fails because he loves this world too much. And I think that, again, that's a very medieval answer, but it shows that all of them had these, feet of clay in a way.
I think it's interesting that if you look at leadership in other cultures, like look at the Mayans, look at the pyramid building, look at the rituals, look at the bloodletting, right? Look at, we know when the eclipses will happen. The eclipse was mentioned in the excerpt that Kathleen read. Look when we have command of the stars, we have command of the skies, we're the liaison. There's that mythological reason for being that is invoked through history, right? It's mythic. Look at the heroes of old, half God, half human. Human mother, God was their father, right? We want to instill this. There's a lot to be, there's the whole myth, you talked about Dan Brown, the blood of Christ being literally passed on through the lineage. There's that story going on. I mean, there's so much about why should somebody lord over the rest of us? What special qualities do they have? Even Victoria and Albert. We must be, Albert, the ideal family, right? So Bertie, stop misbehaving. You're supposed to be representing the ideal here, right? There's that whole idea. I just find it interesting that maybe that, and this separation of church and state that we're so careful about today, that maybe we need to re-examine some of the myths that we're still living with, right? And that the whole idea that we can amass wealth and we're supposed to admire people because they're wealthy, because that's a sign that God is blessing us with his boons. There's very old ideas running through the culture still to this day. And as we re-examine our story, as we re-examine how we're using each other and our resources and our planet and our right to be here and what is true caretaking, what is true spirituality, what are we actually doing here and why? I just think that all of this needs to be re-examined in the new story that we need to tell ourselves and what we're about. That's all. I'm just saying that's why myths are so important. They tell us about ourselves, our paradigm, our beliefs. They're part of that repository from the ancient through the present to the future. All of it's up for grabs to re-examine. And I think they're enduring. We need to be careful about what stories we tell ourselves and why. The retelling of stories. I think they're potent. They're potent and they're important and they're up for grabs in our day.
I agree
They're
with you.
vehicles that shape us. Winston Churchill said, I love this. He said, we shape our buildings and then they shape us. And I think that the stories we tell are artifacts and edifices that shape us more so than we know. And I think that our age has brought us to the brink of ecological disaster. Look at the strife around the world. Look at us imperfect humans. I think that we need to examine the edifices that we put up in our worldview and how they're continuing to shape us and how we need to re-examine them and reshape them in a way going forward.
Interesting.
That's all.
That's all.
I agree with you. And it's interesting you mentioned Churchill. You know, someone asked Churchill when he was writing his history of the English-speaking peoples what he thought about Arthur. Do you think Arthur existed, sir? And he said, well, I don't know. But if he didn't, he should have.
Good answer.
Yeah.
A more recent writer, whose name I've forgotten, a scholar studying this material said, if you take Arthur out of history, it leaves an Arthur-shaped hole behind. So there was someone there to fill that hole.
Yeah.
And that will be the name that's come down to us. So, you know.
Yeah.
But you're right about myth. I say again, the quotation from before, myth is always happening. It has happened, it will happen, and it is happening all at the same time. So yeah, we need to listen to myths. But we don't need to change them too much. That's one thing I will always fight against, that, you know, if people start trying to redo myth in the sense of making it different because it works for us now in that way, I think that's working against the myth. You have to take the myth as it comes and work with it, and that's where the change will happen. It's not that you can go in and say, look, I don't like this myth, I'm going to change it. It doesn't feel right for me. That's the thing you've got to avoid.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and why this is enduring is because it's holding up ideals that we want to strive to, right?
Coming
It's
back to the hero journey.
really looking at, you know, there's so much in there. So.
And back to you, Mr. John. Thank you so much for your continued exploration, taking us on this journey. I'm never going to do this kind of research in this kind of depth. So
Thank you for doing it for us.
Yeah, thank you for doing all this work for us, and then giving us all this nuggets of wisdom after hours and hours and hours of research. This is fun and fan. Yeah, decades of right, exactly.
Yeah.
What you have to do now, don't you? You have to go out and buy the book.
Right. Yeah, we got to buy the book. Right. Okay.
You see, kind of. But no, it's just great that people love it. And obviously, you know, whenever I don't come in contact with my readers very often, but when I do, they seem mostly to have nice things to say. So I can't be doing it too bad a job.
Yeah, you're doing a fabulous
Well,
job.
thank you not just for telling us about the lost tales, but about the deeper meaning and why we care, right? Why this is enduring.
Yeah.
what it means in life, the whole game.
Wonderful to have you all here. Thank you for joining us on Conversation for Exploration. Tune in next week for continued conversations and this kind of exploration. So thank you, John. We'll look forward to talking to you some more because I know you've got another 6 or 8 books in your mind just in the next several months.
I'll come back in November and tell you all about Artorius Castus.
All right, let's do it. All right. Okay, have a wonderful day, everyone. Stay in good health.
Well, I will say that this forum is all about examining our worldview, right? And also saying, let's shape it for the future. Let's shape it and decide and navigate collectively where we want to go. So I appreciate that we need to examine past, present, to really take aim at our future. And the legends that we are drawn to, the stories that we see our own truths in, these are very much a part of our worldview and our paradigm in shaping it, and it's fun to dive deep into them, the ones that are the most lasting. So thank you for all that.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you.